Hi, I'm Dr. Sedna Bokiria, and this is Leader Voices, a show about leaders and their infinite ability to change the world. Each episode in Leader Voices, we dig into stories and sparks from for-purpose leaders, coaches, comedians, luminaries, and everyday heroes from around the globe. Tales of impact and failing forward, of aspirations and innovations, and the infinite and inspiring ways that social purpose leaders lead and make the world a better place. Join us today as we introduce a new guest. Jodi Barrientos is the CEO of Ribbon Biolabs, which offers a novel technology for the automated synthesis of long DNA molecules of any complexity. The company was founded in 2018 and based in Vienna at the world-renowned Institute of Science and Technology in Austria. Prior to joining Ribbon Biolabs, Jodi was vice president of commercial marketing for the diagnostics genomics group at Agilent Technologies. She's led international teams focusing on building brand awareness, driving market access, and executing key strategic mergers and acquisitions worldwide. Throughout her career, she has led roles on the clinical side and on the commercial ops side. She served at multiple large-scale diagnostic companies, including positions at QIAGEN and Roche Diagnostics. Her many degrees are in molecular biology and microbiology from Purdue University. She's a mom and a mentor, and it is such a pleasure to welcome her on Leader Voices today. Jodi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sadhna. Man, that introduction, it makes me, when you revisit all of it, it makes you feel like, oh, I've done something.
That's actually an excellent way to kind of transition into, one of my first questions for you. I mean, I want to talk about how it all began for you, your story. But one of the other things that I think is really important to start off with is, do you ever just look in the mirror and say, I turned out okay. My family did a good job. I'm a good person. I'm contributing to the world. I'm working on life-changing technology. Talk to me about that moment when you really do reflect on where you've been and where you are.
Yeah, I think it's something that I don't do often enough, right? And I think none of us do. You don't take the time to reflect. And I think especially women, when you think about how we perceive ourselves and all of that, we tend to go towards the negative. If you think about performance reviews, I'm always like, oh, let me give you my short list of areas to work on. But those things that I'm going to, that I did that were great, I'm just going to set those to the side or quietly talk about them. So I think the answer is no, I don't do it often. But I think in the moments when we think about the progress of the team and where we're going and all this stuff, I think it's a moment where it's like, oh yeah, we really, I've made progress. I've done a lot of things and I do have contribution to especially the life sciences area.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think you should. As soon as we hang up, I think you should look in the mirror and say, I'm a good person. I turned out okay. And maybe call your family and say, thank you.
By the way, I'm a good person. No, absolutely. And we talk about it takes a village to raise our kids, but I think it takes a village to raise a leader. It's always fun to take that moment and say, okay, who are those people that have impacted me along this journey? And what did they do? And what have I become as a result of their influence? So it's good to think about stopping and calling and reflecting.
Sure. So tell me about how it all began for you. Where did you get into the STEM field?
Yeah, so I always say that my career has been one of a journey of curiosity, right? So it's not been anything necessarily intentional or linear for that matter. It's been kind of, okay, well, this is cool. What about this? How do I go in this direction? So I started out in Roche Diagnostics very, very young, out of my university days, and then kind of navigated the career of, hey, I'm going to fall into this leadership position, which is really how leadership happened, and then navigate through. And there have been interesting pause moments throughout my career as I've tried to navigate, how do I be a mom? How do I be a leader? How do I make sure that I have time for both? And so that's been kind of the journey is those pause and then inflections and high rapid growth moments throughout the career positions. Yeah.
So as a STEM mom, which you were one of the first people I ever saw put that on their LinkedIn profile. And I found it so refreshing and inspiring because I never really thought about it as something you could put as part of who you are and what you do. How do you guide your children? Are they passionate about science? Let's start there.
Yeah. So, I put that on there and I normally don't mix home life and work life. Like I try to keep those as separate as possible just to make sure that I give myself boundaries. But being a mom is my most important job at the end of the day, and I'm a CEO. So having that balance of mom is the priority, I think kind of putting it out there in the world and just being like, look, I balance all of this, but also I got my kids and I learn as much from my kids as I do any moment in my career. And they have such a funny and an interesting engagement with science because it's always been there as a result of my career. And so they, talk about engineering and my daughter is talking about how you can modify organisms right now. She's 6. And so she's always like, Mom, can we turn this apple into something if I take the DNA? And I'm like, oh my goodness, we got a long road to hoe here. But at the same time, like keep thinking that way, keep being creative and keep really having that passion. So yeah, we talk about it at dinner. It comes up in daily life, and I think there's something so important about the curiosity that science gives us that we can instill in our kids and also learn from our kids.
Sure. And, they don't care that you're CEO. They don't care that you're just, a globetrotter. To you, you're their hero and their mom. I remember when we last spoke, you were talking a little bit about how you balance the work-life balance between being a CEO, really being a global traveler because of your work and how you balance that with parenting. Tell me a little bit about some of the neat ways in which you guys bring the world into your home.
Yeah. Very early on in my career, I talked to my husband about the fact that, I want to be a mom, but I also want to be a leader. And that's a hard thing to do. And so how do we figure out our schedule in order to accommodate those both kind of parallel paths that I want to run? And so I'm lucky to have a fantastic foundation of a network here at home to be able to support things like waking up at 3 a.m. to take calls or jumping on a plane. At October, I'm traveling 3 weeks out of the month, and being able to explain that to the kids and being able to understand that. But I'll give a good example. During the pandemic, all of a sudden travel was shut down, but we still had to be global and we still had to have those meetings. And I had teams in China, I had teams in Australia, I had teams in the US, Europe. And so we had to navigate that. And so it was, how do we, as a family, accommodate for those time zone shifts that we still have to work with? And so we had a moment where I had to have a week's worth of China meetings and we had moms in China. So I shifted the time zones. We put the oven clock on China time. We put the microwave clock on California time, and mom was in China. So when she was in her room, she's in China. And so I think that giving them that perception of there's work stuff that happens on a different timeline than what home stuff happens has really helped them to understand. And we've kept the clocks that way. So we have a clock that's always set to Vienna time. So they know when mom's in Vienna, this is what time it is for her. And so I think they've got that kind of perception of the alternate kind of time zone universes that happen on a regular basis in our house.
That is so cool. I just want to say you made it fun.
Yeah. Yeah. And you have to, right? Otherwise, it becomes work for them. And I think that's something that we always keep really important is this can't become an influence or an impact on them, but it has to be part of their lives. So how do you incorporate it in a way that works for them and doesn't disrupt them?
Right. No, I just love that. It's such a great idea. And it's something that I'm definitely going to use with my son. He's 9. And I just love the idea of bringing that because, their imaginations are running wild as is. And so any way that you could take something that's really, challenging for many people to, fight jet lag or to just balance, the wellness of your body by, not getting maybe as much sleep because you have to adjust and turning it into, hey, mom's in China. I love that.
She's in the bedroom, but she's also in China. Her brain's in China, right?
I love that. I love that. So tell me a little bit about essentially intellectual stimulation. So I know that Ribbon Biolabs is headquartered in Austria, but it's closely connected to the world-renowned Institute of Science and Technology, which is in Austria, which is a university campus. So talk to me about the intellectual stimulation of those spaces. You're brilliant. You're around brilliant minds. There's so much going on. I mean, just talking about it, I can kind of feel that magic that many university campuses have. What does it feel like? And how does it keep you intellectually stimulated?
Yeah, it's interesting. I come from big companies where there's, I think, an infrastructure of that kind of mindset and intellectual kind of build, but they're all working towards a similar goal, right? When you come to startup, you've got to have, again, kind of that village to help build you up and infrastructure, both from the networking perspective, but also from the scientific perspective. So I find that in the world that I'm in this startup culture, you pull from outsiders a lot more. And so coming from Exista now, it's really fascinating because we rely on them a lot of times to pull from information. Sometimes it's, hey, do you have this piece of equipment? Or can you sequence this for us? Or whatever it is, right? So that we can really bounce ideas off of each other, bounce capabilities off of each other, and continue to grow that. And I think that's one of the things that I love about startup culture, but also that I love about Vienna culture when it comes to biotech. Vienna, when I joined the company, they said it's in Austria. And I said, where? And they said it's in Austria. And I said, but that's not a hub of biotech. And they said, well, no, but we're trying to get there. And so it's interesting because it's a very close network of individuals who are trying to build up a biotech network within this amazing country that's known for innovation and amazing culture in the arts, and being able to kind of encompass that. You can feel the tangibility of innovation in Vienna, in my opinion, because it's got that root of culture to it. So I absolutely love it. I think when I'm there, it's just this kind of uplift of innovation, of excellence, of intellect that you're surrounded by, and that's amazing.
Sure, sure. That is amazing. I would love to visit one day because
Come visit us anytime.
wonderful. So when we talk about the science, so you're talking about synthetic DNA. Explain it to me as if I'm a 6-year-old who has no idea what you do.
So absolutely. So this is our normal conversation, right? So synthetic DNA. So we've talked about diagnostics when it comes from a genetic perspective, right? You're looking for something, you're reading the DNA to get the output. And that's one form of synthetic DNA. What the company that I'm working with is now writing. So now that we know so much about the human genome, how can we write molecules to be able to then say, okay, we have this series of letters that create this gene or code for this protein or antibody or whatever it may be on the backside, so that we can use those in new biological processes. So this has really come from a transition of, all right, now we know the read side of synthetic biology, and now to the write. So as we start to expand the capabilities on the right side and the building out synthetic molecules, what else can we do? And COVID is the prime example of that, right? There were companies out there who were working on mRNA vaccines. They were working on it prior to COVID. All of a sudden, COVID hits, and now there's this explosion of requirement for this type of vaccine to get out quickly. And so because they started this technology around mRNA, we've seen this just expanse in biopharma where we need DNA to get to RNA in order to make those technologies work. So that's really the technology that we're doing. So we're putting those A's next to the T's, next to the C's, next to the G's, and providing companies with those written molecules to be able to then manufacture. And this is, I'm so excited about the technologies that are coming out in the next 10 years. It's mind-blowing thinking of the things that we're going to be able to do as a result of the right synthetic biology side of what's coming. And so it's going to be an interesting ride in science in the next 5 to 10 years for sure.
Incredible. So what did people do before synthetic DNA was an option?
Yeah, a lot of different things, right? So synthetic DNA, synthetic biology has been around since I think 1983, 1986. So for almost 40 years, we've been doing things in synthetic biology, and so there's been ways of getting there, whether it's through cloning, which is just an incredibly laborious process, or taking alternate methods, or using entirely different technologies to get to a drug state or detection of a trait for a plant or other. So now we've been kind of limited due to the technology, and now we're turning towards, okay, what are the limitations that are removed now that we can do this? Less laborious processes, more capability of interrogation of the number of genes that we can look at, and really expanding from there. So we're making scientists' life easier, and making the knowledge database just that much greater because we can go to these longer and more complex molecules. And it's telling us more about disease states. It's telling us more about how to treat and cure genetic illnesses. It's teaching us about how to modify organisms so that they provide different types of nutrition. I mean, when you look at synthetic biology, you see everything from space to cosmetics to your normal diagnostics type procedures. So it's really everything, which is really super cool.
Yeah, it sounds as if you're taking something that has been around for 40 plus years, but you're in a position where the technology has advanced so much in those 40 years that you're able to get rid of a lot of the tedious steps and the things that really prevent you from getting to the outcome. So you're really
Absolutely.
focused on that part.
Yep.
Fascinating. That does sound really exciting and innovative for the world across all sectors. So very cool. Very cool. So you went from chief business officer to CEO. Talk to me a little bit about the rapid growth that you've experienced both personally and professionally, going from huge, large industries to startups to, going from chief business officer to CEO.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride. I think, I have gone from large industry to small industry, and I think there's kind of a balance of position levels that you get there, right? So a startup CEO is not going to necessarily be the equivalent of a large company CEO in terms of breadth and demand and things like that, but still the accountability for an entire company. Coming from large industry to smaller industry has been interesting because while you have a core set of challenges in a large company, what you also have is a lot of red tape, right? Because there's process, there's protocol, there's, you make a decision, but that's not when the action is taken. There's always a delay before the action can be taken, right? In startup, you make a decision and you go, right? And you kind of have your fingers crossed behind your back that it was the right choice to make. So I think there's an interesting pressure that falls on that decision making in startups. But transitioning from that world to this world, I think it's just been drawing on parallels of what were the best practices there. How do we take that, shrink the budget, and speed up the process and the path forward, and really implement them? Because at the end of the day, you do things in a very similar way in a company, regardless of the size of it, right? Things still have to go from customer to quote to cash and back into investment, right? And so I think that's all similar. From a leadership perspective, it's been interesting. I think my favorite part of all of it has been just learning a lot more about myself. And every time I'm in a new leadership role, whether it's, leading a team of 2, leading a team of 100, leading a company of 42, it's been, what do I need to do to serve this team so that they can do their jobs the most appropriately? And I kind of hate servant leadership as a buzzword because it's all the rave right now. If you ask any leader right now, they're going to say, I'm a servant leader. But I think there's something really elegant about the fact that, if you can figure out for the team that you're leading, regardless of the leadership level that you're at, what those needs are to get the job done, then you can give them those things and empower them to drive it forward. So that's kind of been something that I've carried through each of those leadership positions, regardless of, is it VP of marketing? Is it CBO and figuring out the path to market? Or now is it CEO and figuring out the true path of the company? And so that's been a journey that I think my favorite book, anyone who knows me well knows that this book, I read it every time I change a position. It's Michael Watkins' The First 90 Days. And if you stop and read that book before you start any position and give yourself that moment to pause and plan and reflect on how you're going to drive things forward, I think there's always that then kind of structured path. All right, here's my first 90 days. Here's what I've got to do. Here's what I've got to achieve. And then how do we go from there to the next step?
I had to write it down. The first 90 days, I make a joke that, you can't really understand anything and everything should have a 90-day trial period. And so it really resonates with me that the book that you're talking about.
Will love this book.
Okay,
It's phenomenal. It's phenomenal just to stop and read, because if nothing else, it gets you to pause and say, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? And what does it do for me for the next 90 days? And he's got, I always say, someone has done this before me, so I might as well read a book about it in order to figure out what those people who have been successful first have done, and then take my learnings from it. And this is one that I think just has such valuable learnings. So
yes, I love it. So with remote work, so post-COVID era, right, we've had such an uptick in controversy, but also in building teams that have high autonomy, high individual. I say that I like to hire people who are very neurotic naturally. So, they drive themselves. No one has to be there to say, hey, what are you doing? There's this neuroses within them that pushes them to do what they need to do because it's just part of their DNA, let's say. And so talk to me about difficult communication, dialogue, those conversations where you're in an organization, we're in a time where we have employees that we're working with who you have to be able to, especially with a global team, you have to be able to have autonomous individuals who have a certain level of neuroses to self-drive. And how do you find these people and how do you build organizational cultures where that level of respect is there all the way around?
yeah, I think for me, it's all about the culture and setting the culture right and the expectations of the company right in the first place, or your organization, whatever you're working towards, right? So I think having a culture of collaboration, a culture of transparent communication, if you set that up right and you say, this is my expectation as a leader of you as an individual within the team, within the company, within the organization, that becomes kind of a mandate, right? So how are you, and we always try to put values and culture as a part of even performance reviews at the end of the day. So how are you upholding that so that everybody's set to the same expectation in a global kind of virtual hybrid world that we work in? In science, it's interesting because you can't have 100% remote, right? You've got to have people in the lab doing the lab work. And so how do you keep those two groups communicating well when you have a group of people who have a constant dialogue because they are right beside each other and they're talking through the science, they're talking through the steps, they're talking through the next steps. And you've got this group who's kind of set aside, who's out in the field or remote in some way, who needs to catch up constantly, right? So I think I've always hated instant messaging. I've hated the fact that I'm attached to my phone for text messages, but Slack is life when it comes to remote working, at least in our world, right? And I encourage people to constantly be saying, hey, we open a Slack channel for this moment because we need constant communication about, keeping everybody up to date on what's happening who are not in the room. And so, if they're having a discussion in the lab or at the lunch table, hey, put it in Slack if it was something that was relevant so that everybody's up to speed and keep that communication going. But then as a remote employee, you've got to keep yourself informed and asking because you can't assume that you know. And I think it's interesting because I'm 9 hours away from my company at any given point, right? Because I live in California, the company is headquartered in Vienna. And so number one, I offset myself by waking up much earlier than I would like to, but also to try to cover as many of those hours as possible to be able to kind of drive things forward, but also just making sure that you have the right set of cadence of meetings set up so that you're constantly informed, you're constantly engaging, and you're not making uninformed decisions as a result of being physically distant from the company. And I think if you can close that physical distance through communication, then you solve it, right? And I think that's what you just constantly have to be checking for.
Right. Brilliant. It's a interesting dilemma. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before with like the large organizations and then the startup culture. In the large organizations, you have this delay where, things move and things happen, but there's a delay. And with startups, it's almost as if it happens and maybe there's some mistakes and then you learn and then you continue to grow. So this is an excellent example of, I think, something that a lot of people struggle with in startup culture because it's that balance of how do you get the right people, limited budgets. Remote work is really important to a lot of today's workforce. How do you give them that level of autonomy without having the pain of the disconnects?
Yeah. You can't micromanage, but at the same time, you can't leave everyone completely alone, right? Everybody's got to keep that good fluid communication. But you asked about, hiring and things like that. I mean, it's one of the core things that we look for is how do they fit into the culture? And for me, I've been extremely fortunate because number one, I came into a company that is just wildly diverse. I mean, we're in Vienna, but 3% of the company is Austrian. So we call them the minority in the company, right? So, which is, unheard of. US numbers are extremely low, but building. So we're starting to kind of shift the dynamic. And so as, I've come into this company with just an amazing, diverse group of employees. I've also been able to bring in what I like to call my gap fillers, right? And this is what I think about every time I hire someone is, what's the company gaps? What are my gaps? And how do I fill for those? And so I've been able to hire some people that I've worked with in the past who I know complement really well and have the skill set to be able to bring it up. And, that's something I think we all surround ourselves with people that make us better leaders. And I have to, say that I have an amazing team that just levels me up and makes my job easier. So when you can do that, right, and have a core team of leaders underneath you that are directing in a same culture and same mindset that you lead with, I think it becomes much easier because it's consistency all the way through.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And so 3% are from Vienna. Who else is involved here? Because I remember you telling me the statistics of your company demographics, and they were really diverse.
It's crazy. So we have 23 different nationalities. That's probably changed since we've hired a couple more people on 23 different nationalities in the company of 42 people. So if you take that math, it's relatively interesting, right? So we've recruited people into Vienna. Vienna is kind of a melting pot of individuals anyway, right? A lot of people want to live in Vienna. It's the best place to live in the world, right? It always gets ranked on that list. And so it's a nice place for people to be convinced to relocate to. But then also, as we've started to expand our remote group, we've been thinking about where do we want positions located around the world to be able to pull that in. And so we've got, folks in the UK, we've got folks in the US, and then now we're starting to get a little bit more global as we move on. But, that's not the only balance. We have a 40% female population in the company. So almost half of our team, and again, this is probably tipped in the last few days because I know we've been hiring more women, almost half of our company is female. And so when you look at, you always hear diverse teams are better, right? And having a good mixture of individuals is better. It's fascinating how much better it is because when you live it and you get automatically into an environment of everyone's coming from a balanced spot because you've got a good balance, you've got a good mix, decisions become more robust, right? Feedback becomes more robust. The way that just daily work is done becomes more robust because you've got a good balance of different individuals bringing together the execution. So it's actually fascinating the way that the company works given its diversity.
It sounds like an incredible place to be a part of.
Absolutely. No, I love it. I love it. And I always said, startups is a scary place to be, and I'm not sure that I want to do this. I won't say never, but I will likely never return to big industry after jumping to the startup world.
What about networks? I mean, you recommend The First 90 Days as a book that you reread, which speaks volumes to me because there's a couple books every single year that I reread. And so anybody who uses that term, I reread this every single year. It speaks volumes of the recommendation. Podcasts, any tips, strategies, tools that keep you organized? I have, a remarkable that I use to write down all my notes. Tell us about any networks that you feel have supported your growth in terms of education, being a female C-suite leader, any advice that you can really give our listeners for resources that really help you stay on track with all the wonderful things that you're working on.
Yeah. So, I mean, we live in the era of social media, right? So the network groups that you can get involved with are just phenomenal, right? And I find myself involved in groups not only that level me up within science, right, within the life science arena or the biotech field, but also adjacent. And so I've spent a lot of time with Chief in the past. I'm not actually currently a member, which I need to get back on. And so that's a group of women in particular who are leaders, who are coming from all different areas, who work as core groups to kind of solve problems, right? So we're all, despite the fact that we're in different market segments or different categories, business is business, right? You have similar problems. Being a female leader is being a female leader, right? You're bumping up against the same challenges. And so being able to communicate that across a diverse group that may have experienced it with just a slightly different lens, I think is really cool. And that group in particular, when I was interviewing for a position in startups, it was funny because I was getting this, you got a really good pedigree, but at the end of the day, you've never done startup before. And it's like, okay, well, what do I need to do to prove that I can do this? And it's, well, we're going to have to take, a risk on you. We're going to have to take a bet, a gamble. And in my mind, I'm going, but I have done all of these things in really important companies. How could this be? And so I started talking to some of the women and they said, you need to take the professionalism and kind of throw it out the window. You need to show the grit, right? Stop showing up so refined and executive presence and all of these things. They've got to be able to see that you're going to get down and dirty and be able to do all these things. And it was like, oh. And as soon as I started changing my trajectory towards their experience of success, it was like, okay, now I understand how to engage in this way. And so being able to take those nuggets landed me the role at the end of the day, right? And has been able to then show, I can prove, yes, I did have the grit all along. I just wasn't presenting myself well. So Chief is a really cool network group. I think finding your tribe within LinkedIn in terms of the information that you get in. So I always try to find what are the groups that are talking about the things that I want to hear. And so being able to tap into, whether it's life sciences, whether it's diagnostics and genomics or other. My son has a cardiac disorder, and so I work a lot with the consortiums around that and get an interesting network of moms who are going through the same type of thing in that environment that I am and being able to build off of that. So how do you deal with this while you're dealing with that? So I think it's always don't find a group and stick with it because it's a group and you're in it, but find a group that works for you in that moment of need. And I think that's always got to be a dynamic infrastructure as you navigate around your paths.
Sure. Brilliantly put. I really appreciate that. I think it's fascinating that when you interviewed for startup, they were like, you're a little bit too corporate for us. And I feel like every corporate job I've ever interviewed for, now I know why I didn't get it. I think I was way too gritty for them. They're like, this girl is never going to follow the rules. She's going to go her own way. But it's interesting to think about how you are viewed coming from corporate America and going into a startup and wondering, like, will this person be able to roll their sleeves up and really get, down and out, knowing we don't have the same resources, knowing that we don't have that same level of bureaucracy.
Exactly.
Interesting. So then we talked a little bit about how excited you are about the future. Tell me a little bit about what's next.
Oh, some days I wish I knew. And that's one of the things that's cool is startup world is kind of, next steps there are always dynamic and interesting. It's interesting. I think for the first time in my career, I'm kind of like, let's ride this wave and see what happens, right? And a good friend of mine just wrote an article earlier this week talking about the fact that, women who jump from level to level or dynamically across very quickly, that becomes kind of a habit and becomes almost an addiction, right? And I think there's something about, what's new, what's next, and how do we get to the next level and how do we get to our next thing? And for me, it's really interesting because I think that because startup world moves so quickly, I'm able to go, okay, we're going to get to the next level. And how do we create a new market? How do we bring this technology further and further? And so I think it's going to be, watch out because this company is going to go hard and fast because there's a lot of things that we can do. And then it's riding that market wave and seeing how big we can become. But for me, I'm one of those people who I don't sit still well, even in the quiet moments. And so it's like, okay, where are my gaps? What do I need to do? And so, I'm learning Spanish because why not? And, it's always that, I'm never a finished product, right? I've got a lot of rough edges. So it's always kind of what are those next level up moments? So I'm going to turn that question to you. Are there anything interesting that you're working towards that, would be interesting to share?
We're so similar. It's interesting that you say that. So I was driving to meet a mom for like happy hour. Her son and my son are best friends. And I was telling you this, I was driving to meet her and there was silence in the car. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is an opportunity for me to listen to a podcast, to listen to an audiobook. I can't sit here in silence. So I'm driving there and, my car's on auto drive and I'm just like flipping through the phone, looking for that, filler in a way, because I don't sit still well. And one of the things recently that I've been talking to a lot of my colleagues and peers about is this concept of hedonic adaptation. So we have a natural equilibrium of baseline happiness and fulfillment that's just genetically predisposed. So it's interesting because the research shows that even people who have been incarcerated, what happens is they have this negative experience and then, yes, there's a low, but then what ends up happening is it ends up going right back up to their natural equilibrium of happiness. And same thing for people who win the lottery and have really wonderful things happen to them. They eventually end up right back at that baseline. So for me, I'm in all of these CEO groups where I have a lot of people who are in these groups who, have sold their businesses 10 times, 10-figure sales, and they're killing it. And I'm in these groups thinking to myself, shit, what am I going to do next? What am I going to do next? Like I need to, and the beauty of it is reality kicks in. I know the science, I understand the psychology, and I think to myself, focus on how much you've accomplished, how far you've come, where you've come from the past until now. But it is a constant battle between, I want to learn more. I want to grow as quickly as possible. I have a lot of, neuroses. And at the same time, I have to really think about, hey, it's okay. Like you don't have to do it tomorrow, right? You have time, I hope.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think it's interesting because there are so many distractions, right? You've got to be better at this. If you went to the gym more, if you did this skincare, if you had this intelligence level, or if you knew more about politics, if you knew more about world, scenarios, we don't ever think about that moment of pulling back down to ourselves. Like that is something to work on. And I think that's interesting that we index on all of the external things and don't always think first to focus on that internal baseline. That's interesting. I'm going to take that away.
Thank you. No, I appreciate you so much taking the time to connect with me and to talk to me about these complex notions of our everyday life. It's like we are go, go, go. And so like taking some time to just think about everything, it just, I don't think it happens enough. And one of the things that I shared with you that I want to work on is being in rooms with different networks of people who really do force me to be uncomfortable and who, push me to do things that my introverted self doesn't want to do. I'm totally fine being, working from home and not leaving the house and just hanging out with my son. So I got to be, a little bit more out there.
No, absolutely. And it's funny because coming from a fellow introvert, right, it has to be a conscious effort to put yourself in those scenarios. And I think people inherently believe that leaders, especially at the C-suite level, they're extroverts. This comes naturally for them. Having a conversation, you can walk up to anyone and have a conversation. Of course you can. That's what you're paid for. It's not that easy, right? And I think that is an understatement in terms of not only the effort that it takes to really consciously do it, but the amount of drain that it poses on a daily basis in terms of when we're in these dialogues and how much our social battery is draining as a result of them and how we're not taking the time to fully recharge, right? You get it close enough so you can go back out there, but you don't ever give it time to get, all the way back up to the top so that you're operating at your best self. And I think that's an interesting dilemma, especially for introverts in a leadership position.
Sure. Yeah, you nailed it. The external perception of your capabilities and your talent sometimes aren't aligned with the energy levels it takes to kind of demonstrate that. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we, talking about the concept of living in social media and this era of media, there's also kind of this, what I'll call a passive need for social engagement that I think also we don't necessarily internalize as introverts, right? That this is taking a toll on us. And we talk about this a lot in my leadership teams and in my mentor groups is you don't need to be liked, but everything that we engage with is get the likes, right? If you think about even LinkedIn, right? I look at the posts that the company puts forth. I look at my own posts and see how many people are liking this, how many people are engaging with this. And for what intent? We want to make sure that the content that we put out there, coming from my marketing background, we want to make sure that the content that we're putting out there in the world is good. But I think that there's also this, okay, we need to be liked. And as a result, that all that like comes. But it's really, that's not what we need to be focusing on. And I think that if more leaders took the time to focus on, stop worrying about being liked, start worrying about being respected, and get forward with making sure that you have a good balance, I think there's something really interesting that comes from that. But again, that conscious effort that you have to put forth to make it happen.
Really well put, because what you're doing is you're saying, hey, focus on the value, focus on the big picture meaning of the like. The like is the instant validation that anyone could just take a second to do. Sometimes it's automated, right? It doesn't even have to be a human who's doing it at this point in time. But that big picture thinking, focus on being respected, focus on your values, focus on people remembering you because of who you are, which really brings me full circle to when I first met you. It's like, you've always been such an inspiration to me and even a mentor, because you always ask, is there anything I can do to support you? And that's rare. And so it speaks to your heart in a way when someone takes that extra step to really think about how they can support you. And it's inspirational, and it's a ripple effect, because then I do the same thing for others. So thank you.
Yeah, I think, the network of your network, right, is so important. And I think when it's that feedback loop, right? And I think sometimes we forget about that when we're thinking about the people that we engage with, right? It's not always, what can I get from them? Like, you have to give a little bit of yourself in every engagement. Otherwise, that engagement isn't worth it, right? And I think about this in my mentorship roles, and okay, how much am I giving to them? How much are they giving to me, right? So when I choose who I'm going to engage with, when I choose who I'm going to share my time with, right? You need to get something out of it, but they need to get something out of it to make it worth it. And so it's funny because I found myself really exhausted with networking probably about a year and a half ago, because everybody was reaching out, and I had given myself this task because I had heard it in some networking group. Oh, well, if someone reaches out to you on LinkedIn, and it's somebody who has, a title that makes sense to your network, reach back out to them and have a dialogue. And so I started doing this, and I found that it was not benefiting me in any way. All it was doing was sucking my time. And so then starting and choosing and saying, okay, well, I think these people mutually benefit, what they're trying to do, what I'm trying to do. And you are absolutely one of those people. When I first met you, it was like, we clicked. It was, okay, there is absolutely nothing that I can get from what you're offering right now today, but I know that somewhere along the line, right, we're going to benefit from each other. And so I think once you find those people, then that's your actual network that you build, not these people that click on your LinkedIn and say, okay, I'm going to now follow you or be connected to you, right? It's your network are the people that are mutually beneficial. And we've known each other now technically for, I think, 5 or 6 years. And it's not, we don't stay in touch, but we do, pick it right back up when we go. And that's always in a moment that's beneficial for both of us. And I think there's something really cool about that. And that's what the network should be.
I totally agree. And if you think about the concept, that it's an endless amount of people who are going to reach out to you on LinkedIn. Globalization. I mean, you have people from literally all over the world who will monopolize your time and who will take it and take everything you'll give them if you set it up in that way. So I think you're absolutely right. Like, any true relationship has to be mutually beneficial, mutual respect, kindness, caring, big picture thinking. And the most beautiful thing is when I get to watch you're speaking here, you just published here, you got promoted here. It's like, that even if we don't talk, I'm cheering for you. And I know you're the same way with me. So
Absolutely.
It's a thing that we don't have to talk whether you have a cheerleader for life.
Right. Absolutely. And in those moments where it's like, hey, I've got a podcast, you want to come on it? I'm going to say absolutely. Right. And I think there's something so cool about that. So, and that is the dynamic network where I think, women empowering women. And, we hear that a lot, but I think that these are the moments where it's tangible, right? Where it's, that network all of a sudden pulls up. And I think there's something so cool about that.
Very cool. So last words of advice for listeners, maybe some young women who are interested in getting involved in science and technology. Any advice? I have some children who subscribe to my podcast, mainly because I recruited them from my son's school.
Yeah. I mean, science for women is hard. It's still hard, right? And as much as I hate that, it is hard. And I think there has been over the course of the past several years kind of a slowdown. If you look at the metrics and the numbers, it's been, we had a kind of trajectory in STEM, and now it's kind of backed off again. And I think it's, don't just put yourself in one category when it comes to the possibilities, right? When you think about a career, and I think I've shared this with you, but I just contributed a chapter to a book called The CBO Experience, and it's on self-development. And in that, one of the things that I focus on is that you have to own your own path, right? No one is going to say, no, everyone is going to say this is how you should do it, right? But no one is going to truly know what the outcome of your path is going to be at the end of the day. You set that trajectory, and you set the ability to pull in the resources to make that happen for yourself. And you've got to constantly be focusing energy on, how do I get to what I want to do in my next step? I started out, my college degree was in nursing. I would have made a horrible nurse. There is no question at the end of the day, that was not for me, but that was what I thought I was intended to do. That was small town Indiana girl, right? Now I'm CEO in Vienna and living in California, and have been anywhere but the Midwest and working in that career that I thought was perfect. So don't block yourself in, give yourself the ability to find your way, and never think that everything is linear. I guess on top of that, find your mentors, right? Always find someone who can help you navigate to your best self.
Sure. Excellent advice. I started as a Shakespearean major, and everyone's like, what the hell are you going to do with that? And I'm like, well, I'm going to be a professor. Then I'll be a department chair. And look at me, so far away from it. But everything that I learned in those experiences absolutely are relevant to today.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Jodi. In the show notes, I'm going to make sure that we have every single recommendation from you, the first 90 days being one of them, the publication that you just made reference to, and then any other things that you think will help our listeners to be able to tap into some of these lifelong lessons that you've been able to learn at such a young age.
Of course, I will shoot you a short list of my best reads and podcasts and others. So thank you so much for the time. It is always lovely to catch up, and certainly we will continue this dialogue. But to the listeners, thank you for listening in, and feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I may or may not answer as I've mentioned, but I'm always happy to answer questions and to get new contacts.
Awesome. And we will have all of Jodi's contact information, where you can follow her incredible career, and all the different lessons that I have had the pleasure of learning from her, in our show notes. So thank you so much. I appreciate having you on Leader Voices, and look forward to staying in touch.
Awesome. Thank you, Sadhna.
Thank you all for joining us. I'm Dr. Sedna Bokiria, and this is Leader Voices. This show is brought to you by the American Express Leadership Academy Alumni Network and leaderstories.org. Leader Voices is audio engineered by Robbie Ladd and produced by Crepandy and team at OTVO Digital. Special thanks to Caitlin Johnson and Michael Chang. Thank you, and see you in the next episode.